I'm Hilary Foster, and at 32 I watched my own father tip my grandfather's wheelchair into a snowbank on Christmas night. The chair landed on its side. The wheel kept spinning, ticking in the cold, like a clock that didn't know it was supposed to stop. My grandfather was 88, LB of stubborn dignity in a wet wool coat, and the people who shared his last names shut the door on him without blinking. I'd spoken up. That was the whole crime. I defended an old man at a dinner table, and my father's open hand caught me across the face in front of 12 relatives who suddenly found their plates fascinating. I thought that was the night we lost everything. 10 weeks later, a lawyer slid a folder across a polished table and told me what my grandfather had really been carrying all those silent years. And the number did not fit on one line. Welcome back to Calm Drama. Stories where ordinary families meet. The moment that decides who they really are, and the quiet ones finally get the last word. If stories about dignity, justice, and standing up for the people the world overlooks stay with you, then you are in the right place tonight. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up to before the snow. I cook for a living, 12 years in kitchens, the last 4 as sous chef at a farm-to-table place downtown. And that February, the owner had finally said the word I'd worked toward since culinary school. Chef, my own line, my own menu, my name on the chalkboard. I'd built that the slow way on burns and double shifts and a studio apartment I could finally afford on my own 20 minutes from the suburb where I grew up. Nobody handed me anything, and I liked it that way. The one person who ever acted proud of me was my grandfather, Walter Foster. Walt to anyone he liked, and he liked almost no one in our family by then. He'd had a stroke 3 years back at 75, and after that he lived in my parents' big colonial in Halewood in a downstairs room that used to be a study. I called him every Sunday. I drove out twice a month with soup in a thermos and sat with him while his hands stayed busy, because his hands were never still even. After the stroke took the strength from his right leg, my parents talked about him the way you talk about a leaking roof, expensive, inconvenient a thing you resent paying for. My mother, Linda, would sigh and mention what his care cost, like she was carrying him on her back up a hill. My father, Russell, mostly just left the room. I didn't understand it then. A man raises you, feeds you, and you treat him like a bill. That won't stop coming. I kept thinking there had to be a reason a son could look at his own father with that much cold in his eyes. There was a reason. It took me decades to learn it. The invitation came by phone in mid-December, and it came with conditions. My mother called on a Tuesday while I was prepping for service, and she got to the point the way she always did. Christmas dinner, 7 o'clock. And please, Hilary, don't let your grandfather turn it into a production. Those were her words. A production. I asked what she meant. She said the relatives were coming, the Putes and the Andersons, and the evening needed to look a certain way. She said the wheelchair made the dining room feel like a hospital. She said maybe he'd be more comfortable eating earlier in his room before everyone arrived. I held the phone against my shoulder and kept dicing, because if I stopped, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. My sister Brooke got on the line next, 29, and never once embarrassed by it, and she Spent 4 minutes describing the watch. Our parents had already bought her. Then, she said, almost cheerful, that I should leave the old man home so I could actually enjoy myself. I said I'd bring him. There was a pause that told me everything. I told them I'd handle his chair, his food, all of it, that they wouldn't have to lift a finger. What I didn't say was that I'd already decided he was going to have one good Christmas in that house while he still could. I bought him a new flannel shirt and pressed it myself. I should have heard the warning in that silence. I heard it. I just believed the way you do that. No, one would be cruel to a man on Christmas. We got there at 4 to 7, and the trouble started at the threshold. There was no place set for the chair. The table sat 12 in a room built for 10. And when I rolled Walt toward the empty stretch, near the head, my father stepped in front of us. He looked at the wheelchair like it had tracked mud across his life. That thing's an eyesore, he said, not even quietly, and he wheeled Walt himself into the corner by the sideboard, the bad corner where the right wheel ticked against the floor, register every time it turned. Walt didn't argue. He folded his hands and watched the room with those pale patient eyes. Dinner came out on the good china, prime rib and the works, and my mother served everyone but him. When I asked for his plate, she waved at the kitchen and said there were leftovers from lunch. He could have what was there. Cold ham and a heel of bread. I'd made a braise that morning, his braise, the red sauce one he taught my grandmother 40 years ago, and I'd brought it in a covered dish, hoping to add it to the table. My mother set it on the counter, untouched like a coat she didn't want. Brooke laughed at something on her phone. The Putes talked about a cruise, and my father, carving at the head of the table, looked down the length of it at his own father in the corner and said, the line I will hear until I die. You don't get a seat at this table. The room went quiet for half a second. Then Walt smiled, small and even, and said, something so soft only the nearest few caught it. He said, you sat at plenty of mine. My father's face drained white. He set the carving knife down too carefully. I didn't understand why a sentence about chairs had hit him like a slap. I should have let it go. I know that's what you're supposed to say, but I'd watched a 78-year-old man eat cold ham off a paper towel while his family passed gravy over his head, and something in me stood up before my body did. I said it plainly, no shouting. I said, he is your father, and you're feeding him scraps in the corner. The table stilled. My mother told me to lower my voice. I didn't raise it. I said, 12 people in this room, and not one of you will give him a chair. My father came around the table. I thought he meant to walk me to the kitchen. Talk it out. Save face. Instead, his hand came up and across, and the slap turned my head and rang in my ear like a struck pan. 12 relatives looked at their plates. Brooke covered her mouth, but not before I saw the corner of it twitch. Walt started to push himself up out of the chair, his arms shaking, his whole body refusing the leg that wouldn't hold him, and I crossed the room and put my hand on his shoulder so he wouldn't fall. My cheek burned. My voice did not. I looked at my father and said, you just hit me for asking you to be decent. He straightened his cuffs. He said it again, slower, like he was teaching me a rule of the house. You don't get a seat at this table either. Of you. I understood then that this was never about a chair. It was about who counts as family, and we had just been told. My grandfather's hand found mine on his shoulder and squeezed once. Steady, almost calm. He wasn't surprised. That was the part that scared me. My mother made it official. She walked to the front door and opened it. On the December dark, and the cold came in across the entryway like a verdict. Out, she said. Both of you. She didn't yell. She used the voice she used for canceling subscriptions. We're done. Carrying dead weight. The word landed on Walton on me at the same time, and I felt him flinch beside me. The only time. All night his face moved. I want to tell you I made a speech. I didn't. I just got behind the chair. But here is the thing I need you to understand, because it matters to how I slept later. I did not wait to be thrown out. I was already turning his chair toward that open door. If he goes, I go. I told the room, and I meant it as a choice and not a punishment. The Pute studied the carpet. My Uncle Dale looked like he might speak, opened his mouth, and then reached for his wine instead. 12 adults watched a man in a wheelchair get rolled out into 9 degrees, and the loudest thing in that house was the tick of the bad wheel. On the hardwood, my father followed us to the porch, not to help, to make sure. We left. Behind him, the dining room glowed warm and yellow, prime rib, steaming, my untouched braise cooling on. The counter, the door shut, the deadbolt turned, and we were 2 people in a wheelchair on a frozen lawn with my grandfather's breath fogging in the porch light and the spinning wheel. Slowing, ticking down to nothing. I should have been frightened. Mostly I was clear. I have always been better in a crisis than in a quiet room. I tucked my coat around his knees and got us moving. Getting him off that lawn was the first hard thing. The path hadn't been salted, and the wheels caught on a ridge of ice, and the chair went over sideways into the snowbank by the mailbox. Slow and almost gentle, Walt's arm flung out to catch a fall. That snow softened anyway. I had him upright in 10 seconds. His sleeve was soaked. His hand was already going stiff and red, and the bad wheel was packed with snow, so it didn't tick anymore, it just dragged. I half lifted, half rolled him the 40 feet to my car. He weighed almost nothing. That's a thing nobody warns you about. How light the people who raised you become. I got him into the passenger seat, folded the chair into the trunk, cranked the heat, and put my own gloves on his hands, one finger at a time, while he told me through chattering teeth that he was perfectly fine and that I drove too fast. I did not drive too fast. I drove the 20 minutes back to my apartment on roads gone to glass, and I talked to him the whole way about nothing. The menu, the snow, a cook who'd quit just to keep his eyes open. I carried him up one flight because the chair wouldn't fit the stairwell turn, came back for the chair, and got him into my bed under every blanket I owned. He was shivering. For an hour, I made broth and held the mug for him. Around midnight, the shaking stopped and he slept, and I sat on the floor by the bed in the dark and did the math on what came next. 1 bed, 1 income, a man who needed warmth and medicine and time. I didn't cry. I made a list. I didn't know it yet, but the Cold from that night had already settled. Somewhere in his chest and a clock had. Started running. We figured out a life in a 400 feet apartment. I gave him the bed and took the couch and told him it was good for my back, which was a lie he let me tell. Mornings I'd help him wash and dress. Before my shift, evenings I'd come home, smelling like the grill, and find him by the window with a strip of scrap pine and his pocket knife, his hands moving the way they always moved, peeling thin curls of wood onto a folded newspaper. The first weekend, I finally fixed that. Bad wheel. The bearing was shot. Had been for months. And when I asked why, he'd never had it replaced, he said, replacing things you can fix is how a man goes soft. So I oiled it and packed it and got the tick out of it. And while I had the chair tipped on its side, I noticed something carved into the underside of the wooden armrest, small and deliberate, 2 letters worn smooth by his thumb, W and O. I asked him what it stood for. He said, an old habit, and changed the subject to whether I'd salted the broth enough. That night he finished the thing he'd been whittling and set it on the windowsill. A bird, a little run, plump and tilted, mid-hop. So alive it looked ready to scold me. I'd seen him carve them my whole childhood and never thought to wonder why. There were dozens of them, once on shelves in houses we no longer visited. He turned it in his fingers and looked at it a long moment, the way you look at a photograph, W and O. I thought run and something. I let it go. When you're tired enough, the strangest things stop seeming strange. I had no idea I was living in the middle of the answer to a question I hadn't asked yet. Money got tight fast the way it does when one person's paycheck has to stretch over 2 lives. Walt's medications ran $400 a month even with the discount card, and his old plan had been tangled up in my parents' household somehow. So for a while I just paid cash and sorted the paperwork later. I picked up brunch shifts on my 2 days off. I stopped buying coffee out, which sounds small until you've done it for 6 weeks. The thing about being the reliable one is that you never learn to ask for help. And I didn't. My friends would have lent me money. I never told them I needed it. I told the restaurant I had a family situation and kept my hours up and my mouth shut. And I budgeted down to the dollar at a folding table after Walt fell asleep. My mother called once in early January, not to apologize, to make an offer. She called it. She said the guest room was still open. She said I could come back, get my feet under me, that everyone makes scenes at the holidays. And then, like an afterthought, she said the room was for me, just me. If you ditch the old man, she said, you can come home. I stood in my kitchen with a pot of his braise going on the stove, and I thought about the word ditch like he was furniture left at a curb. Comfort isn't worth what you're charging for it, I told her, and I hung up. I didn't slam it. I'm not a slammer. I just set the phone down and stirred the pot and looked over at a man asleep in my bed who had never once made me feel like a burden, and I understood that I had already chosen the more expensive life and that I would choose it again. The first crack in the ordinary came at a hardware store. I'd taken Walt with me to buy felt pads and a new threshold ramp so the chair would clear the bathroom door, and we were in the lumber aisle because he wanted to feel the oak run his thumb along the grain and tell me which boards were lying about there. Quality. An older man in a canvas jacket stopped at the end of the aisle and just stared. 60s weathered, the kind of hands that have held tools for 50 years. He looked at Walt for a long beat, then took a step closer and said, "You're not." He stopped. He said, "No, couldn't be." He shook his head at himself and almost laughed. "I'm sorry," he said. "You look exactly like a man I worked for a lifetime ago, best in the business." And then he just vanished. The man waited, like he was leaving a door open. Walt smiled friendly and flat and said, "People tell me I have that kind of face." The man nodded slowly, not convinced, tipped his cap and moved on. I watched him go and then looked at my grandfather, who had gone very interested in a piece of red oak. "Who did he think you were?" I asked. Walt set the board down. "Nobody," he said. "A long time ago, he wouldn't meet my eyes." And Walt always met my eyes. On the drive back to my apartment, I kept glancing at him, this frail man in my passenger seat, who'd once made a stranger stop dead in a lumber aisle, and I felt the first small itch of a question. Best in the business at what? I let it sit. I had a double shift that night and a man to feed first, but the itch didn't go away. Some questions, once you notice them, just wait for you. My family didn't go silent. That would have been a mercy. Instead, they kept a steady drip going, just enough to remind me where the door was if I ever wanted back in. Brooke texted me a photo of the watch on her wrist with a caption that read, "Enjoy your charity case." My mother sent a long message about how I was throwing my life away over a man who wouldn't last the year, framed as concern, sharp as a felt knife under the gentle words. My father said nothing, which from him was its own message. For 3 days, I answered nothing. And then Brooke called and got my voicemail and left 30 seconds I'll never forget. "He's nothing," she said like she was correcting my math. "You picked nothing over us." I sat with that for a while. The old me, the one who managed everyone, would have called back and tried to explain, tried to be understood. But you can't reason someone out of contempt they enjoy. So I did the only clean thing. I blocked her number, then my mother's, then my father's, one after another, and the apartment got quieter and somehow easier to breathe in. Walt watched me do it from the bed. "You don't have to fight them for me," he said. I told him I wasn't fighting them. I was just done handing them my afternoons. He nodded, slow, and went back to his run. I want to pause here for a second because if you've ever sat at a table where people who share your blood watched you get hurt and said nothing, then you already understand why I couldn't walk away from him. You don't owe loyalty to people who only offer it on condition. Stay with me. Because what my grandfather was quietly carrying changes everything that comes next. If this is hitting home, hit subscribe so the rest of the story finds you. Walt started talking more in late January, the way people do when the nights get long and the body slows. Mostly stories, and most of them were about wood. He told me about a shop floor he ran in the 80s, the smell of fresh cut maple, the men who worked the joiners, a company he built from a two-man garage into something with his name on the side of a building, Foster and Sons, he said, and his mouth went Tight on the word sons. I asked what happened to it. He was quiet for A, while peeling a curl of pine. Then he said the year they took it all, like it was the name of a season. I asked, who took it? He looked at their incoming, alive in his hands, and didn't answer. That. Instead, he said the thing he'd say 3 more times before the end. The thing that's been carved into me ever since. They can take what you build, he said, never what you are. I thought it was the kind of soft wisdom old men hand out so the young will feel better about a hard world. I told him that was a nice way to think about it. He smiled at me like I'd missed something obvious, which I had, and set the finished run on the sill next to the others. There were 5. Up there by then, a little flock facing the window. He told me his father had taught him to carve them, that a run is the loudest bird for its size, that nobody respects it until it opens its mouth. I laughed. He didn't. He was looking at the birds, and there was something in his face I couldn't name. Something that was not regret and not grief, but lived in the same neighborhood. The year they took it all. I should have asked again. I didn't. I had broth on the stove. The letter came on a Thursday, and it didn't look like anything. I was sorting his mail at the kitchen table, the usual pile of planned summaries and pharmacy notices, when I found a thick cream envelope with a return address embossed in navy ink, Crane and Holloway trustees, certified, requiring a signature, which is how I knew to slow down. I'd signed for it that morning without reading the Zenda. I almost said it with the medical stuff. Then the word trustees caught me. Inside was a single dense page addressed to Walter R. Foster, referencing what it called the annual trustee certification, and halfway down a line about a property tax abatement on the Ashford Mill site. I read that sentence 3 times. As fått million. I had never heard him say those words in my life. There was a reference number, a phone line, and a sentence at the bottom, asking him to confirm receipt at his earliest convenience. I carried it to the bedroom and held it up so he could see. What's Ashford Mill? I asked. He looked at the envelope the way you look at a face from a past life. His expression didn't change much, but his hands went still, and his hands were never still. Old paperwork, he said. Let it be. I asked him whose paperwork required a certified letter and a trustee. He said, mine, in a way that closed the subject like a drawer. I have spent a lot of nights since wondering what would have happened if I'd pushed right then. But he was clear-eyed and calm, and it was his name on the envelope and his business behind it. And a man gets to keep his own secrets in his own last winter. So I did the only thing that felt both respectful and smart. I didn't throw it away. I slid it into the zip pocket of my work bag, where it stayed, a small cream rectangle that I would come back to when everything else had fallen apart. I looked it up because I'm not the kind of person who can carry an unanswered question without picking at it. On my phone, on a break behind the restaurant, he searched Ashford Mill. What came back stopped me cold against the brick. It wasn't a ruin or a memory. It was an operating site, a sprawling complex an hour north of the city, Satellite Photo, showing acres of roof, loading docks, a parking lot full of cars on a workday, a furniture and home goods manufacturer. The listing said, though the brand name on the signage was scrubbed in the public records under a holding company. I stood there with grease on my apron and tried to fit that picture against the man asleep in my bed who couldn't afford his own pills. It didn't fit. I went home that night and asked him once, more gently, plainly. I said, Ash Mill is real. It's huge and it has your name on a trust letter. I told him if he was in some kind of trouble or owed someone. I wanted to help. He took my hand and his grip was stronger than it had any right to be. Hillary, he said, I am not in trouble. I am exactly where I chose to be. Then he asked me to leave it alone, not as a brush off, as a request, one adult to another. And here's where I want to be honest with you about why I didn't tear the world apart to find out more. He was sound of mind, sharper than me on a good day. It was his name and his business and his choice. And whatever it was his to keep, not mine to crack open. So I let it rest. I told myself there'd be time to understand it later. That was the one thing I turned out to be wrong about. There wasn't much later left. There was a good day in early February, and I hold on to it. My one full day off in 3 weeks, sun on the snow, and I decided to cook the way I cook when nobody's paying. I made his braise, the real one, the red sauce pork shoulder that takes 5 hours and can't be rushed. The recipe he taught my grandmother in 1981, and she taught me before she passed. I browned it slow while he sat at the kitchen table directing me like a man who'd never lost an argument about food in his life. Too much heat, he said. Let it sweat. Don't fry it. The apartment filled up with garlic and BA and the kind of smell that makes a small place feel like a home instead of a waiting room. We ate at noon like royalty off mismatched plates. He had 2 helpings, the most I'd seen him eat in weeks, and he closed his eyes on the first bite, the way you do when a taste reaches all the way back. After he carved while I did dishes, and when I sat down, he held something out to me across the table. A rinse smaller than the ones on the sill, finer, the feathers scored in with a detail the others didn't have. For you, he said. I told him it was beautiful and reached for it, and he held on a second, longer than a gift requires. I only carve these for the ones who'd never leave me in the cold, he said. I didn't have anything to say to that, so I just closed my hand around it. It was warm from his hands. I put it in my coat pocket, and I have carried it every day since. I didn't know that little bird was about to become the most important object in my life. I just knew that a man who'd been thrown into the snow had given his granddaughter the thing he made for people he trusted, and that it was the richest I'd ever felt. The cold came back the second week of February, a hard snap that dropped us into single digits, and Walt's body had been waiting for an excuse. It started as a cough, the kind you tell yourself is nothing. By the 3rd day, it had teeth. He got quieter, slept more, ate less, and the braise sat in the fridge in a container. He waved away. I knew the shape of it. Before I admitted it, I'd watched my grandmother go the same way, the slow gathering, the body deciding. I begged off 2 shifts and sat with him, and he insisted he was fine, that he'd buried colder winters than this one. But his color was wrong, a gray under the skin. And when he reached for the water on the nightstand, his hand missed it by an eaten the night his fever spiked. I Didn't argue with myself. I called for an ambulance. While we waited, I packed a bag, his pills, his glasses, the new flannel shirt, and almost without thinking, I tucked the little run into the side pocket and the cream trusty envelope after it. The two things that didn't belong in a hospital bag because some part of me already understood we might not come home together. He gripped the chair's worn armrest as the paramedics lifted him, his thumb finding those two carved letters by habit, W and O, the way another man might touch a saint's medal. The bad will ticked once against the door frame on the way out. I locked the apartment and followed the lights. And the whole drive, I kept my voice steady on the phone with the hospital, professional, calm, a woman who's good in a crisis. It was only at a red light alone that I let myself say the true thing out loud to the empty car. Not yet, please. Not yet. They came to the hospital, which surprised me until I understood it. Pneumonia, the doctor said in a frail man with a damaged heart. And the word, they wouldn't quite say, hung over the room. I'd been there 19 hours when my parents appeared in the ICU waiting area, my mother in a camel coat, my father a step behind, and for one stupid second my chest lifted because grief makes you hope. Then I watched my mother work the room. She found the charge nurse first. She pressed a hand to her heart and said in a voice pitched to Carrie, we've done everything for him, everything for years. She asked about visiting policy loud enough for the family across the way to hear what a devoted daughter-in-law sounded like. My father stood by the window and looked at his phone. Neither of them asked me a single question about Walt's actual condition, his oxygen, his medications, the DNR conversation, the doctor, and I had already had. They asked who else was coming. They asked carefully whether he was lucid, whether he'd been saying anything, and that question landed strangely too specific. A fishhook dress does concern. I told them he was sleeping. My mother squeezed my arm in front of the nurse and murmured that families heal at times like these. And then when the nurse stepped away, she dropped my arm and dropped the warmth with it and asked me where his paperwork was. His what? I said, his affairs, she said, smoothing her coat. Someone has to be practical. Hillary, I looked at this woman, performing love for an audience of strangers while her father-in-law fought for air 20 feet away, and I understood that they hadn't come to say goodbye. They'd come to take inventory. I didn't know yet what they were counting, but I knew it wasn't him. He woke in the small hours, clear as a bell, the way the dying sometimes surfaced for one last lucid tide. The machines hummed. My parents had gone to a hotel. It was just us. He asked me to crank the bed up so he could see me properly, and I did. He looked at me for a long time. Then he reached for my hand and pressed something into it, and I realized he'd had me bring his things to the bedside, the run and the cream, envelope both, and he was giving them back to me with purpose. Keep these. Together, he said. I started to say something soft, and he stopped me. Listen, he said, when this is done, and it's nearly done, you don't fight them at the funeral. You don't argue about flowers or who speaks. You let them have the noise. He squeezed harder. You call Tom Crane. The numbers on the letter. He'll explain what I never could find the words for. I asked him to explain it now while he could, and he shook his head, a small smile. Some things you have to be shown, he said, not told. They wouldn't believe me if I shouted it from this bed. He looked at the run in my palm. They can take what you build, he said again, slower. This time, like he was handing it to me to carry, never what you are. Remember that when the lawyer's done talking, I told him I loved him. He told me I was the only one of them who'd earned the right to say it, and that he'd known what I was made of since I was 5 years old, and gave my whole birthday cake to a kid who had none. Then he closed his eyes, still holding my hand, and I sat with him in the hum and the dark and didn't let go. He died at 4:51 in the morning, the way he lived the last weeks, quietly and without complaint, his hand cooling in mine before the monitor caught up to the truth. I won't perform my grief for you. There are people who fall apart loudly and people who go very still, and I'm the still kind. I sat with him until the sky outside the window turned the color of old pewter. I thanked the night nurse who'd been kind, and I signed the forms, a steady hand signs. Then I went down to the parking garage, got in my car, and held the little run against my chest in the gray light, and I let myself feel it for exactly as long as it took the windows to fog. And then I wiped my face and started making calls. That's not coldness. That's how some of us love in logistics, in the doing of the next right thing. I called the funeral home he'd once mentioned on a quiet street I'd driven past 100 times. I called the restaurant, and then because his voice was still in my ear, I took the cream envelope out of my bag and dialed the trusty line Crane and Holloway and left a message for a man named Tom Crane that my grandfather, Walter Foster, had passed in the night and that he told me to call. I expected a call back in a week. The slow grind of estates. Tom Crane called me back in 40 minutes. His voice was careful and warm and absolutely awake, like a man who'd been waiting a long time for this exact phone to ring. I'm so sorry for your loss, Miss Foster, he said. And then before I could speak, he said the sentence that tilted the floor. There's a great deal we need to discuss, and almost none of it can happen over the phone. My parents took over the funeral within a day, exactly as Walt had predicted. They reappeared the moment there was a thing to be seen managing. My mother booked the cheapest package at a chapel across town, told the relatives it was what Walt would have wanted, simple, and scheduled it for a Tuesday morning when fewer people could come. My father handled what he called the estate, which, as far as anyone knew, amounted to a wheelchair, a suitcase of clothes, and whatever was in a modest checking account. They didn't ask me to speak. They didn't ask me anything except again where his documents were, and again that question had a hunger under it I couldn't place. I let them have the noise like he'd told me to, but there was one moment I keep turning over. The night before the service, I went by the Colonial in Halewood to drop off a box of his things they demanded, and I found my mother alone in the kitchen. No audience, no code, holding a coffee cup, with both hands like she was cold from the inside. She looked older without the camel coat on, she said. Not really to me, that she grew up with nothing, that she'd worn the same 2 dresses through high school and learned to smile, so no one would see the holes in her shoes. She said, Poverty is a smell you never get all the way off you for one breath. I saw the frightened girl under the hard woman, and I almost reached out. Then she caught herself, set the cup down, and the shudders came back over her eyes. Don't look at me like that, she said sharp again. We did what we had. 2. Some of us couldn't afford to be soft about old men. And just like that, the moment was gone, sealed over, and she was telling me to use the side door. On my way out, I went. You can understand where a person's cruelty comes from and still refuse to let it set the table. Tom Crane called the morning after the funeral. By then, I'd buried my grandfather in a 40-minute service where my father called him a complicated man, and my mother dabbed at dry eyes, and Brooke checked her phone, and I'd sat in the back row with the little run in my fist and said my Rayall goodbye in silence. So, when Crane's number lit up my screen, I almost let it ring. I'm glad I didn't. He told me there would be a formal reading of Walter Foster's will, that it was required given the size and complexity of the estate, and that my presence was not optional. The size and complexity. I asked him plainly what that meant. He paused, and I could hear him choosing his words like a man stepping across a frozen pond. MS Foster, he said, your grandfather left specific instructions for how this is to be revealed and in what order and to whom. I have honored every wish of his for 26 years, and I intend to honor this. 1. Then he said the part that made the hair stand up on my arms until the reading. Please do not sign anything anyone puts in front of you. Do not agree to administer anything. Do not let your father file as next of kin, and do not under any circumstances discuss the trustee letter with your family. I said I hadn't told them about it. Good, he said with feeling. Keep it that way for 9 more days. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and looked at the cream envelope on the counter. And for the first time, I let myself think the thought I'd been pushing down for weeks. Whatever Ashford Mill was, whatever my grandfather had really been, my family wanted it badly enough to throw 2 people into the snow, and they had no idea what they'd thrown away. The reading was held downtown on the 31st floor of a glass tower I'd walked past my whole life without once looking up. Crane and Holloway took the entire floor. That was my first clue that 9 days hadn't prepared me for anything. The receptionist knew my name before I gave it. A young associate walked me down a hallway hung with framed photographs of furniture, beautiful pieces, chairs and sideboards and long farmhouse tables. And at the corner, before the conference room, there was a single large frame holding nothing but a logo, a small bird, plump and tilted, mid-hop or run. Under it, 2 words in a quiet serif, run and oak. I stopped so. Suddenly the associate had to wait. And oh, I put my hand in my coat pocket and closed it around the little carving and felt the floor of my understanding shift an inch. The conference room was already filling when I came in. My parents sat near the head of the table in their good clothes. My father, drumming his fingers, my mother's chin lifted, Brooke beside them filming the view on her phone, and there at the far end, in a gray suit that no longer fit him quite right, sat Gerald Voss. I knew the name the way you know a name from old arguments overheard through doors. My father's one-time partner, the Lawyer. A man Walt's mouth had gone tight around once or twice. Voss looked